Can an algorithm ruin your reputation without anyone meaning to? Imagine typing your own name into a search engine, and before you finish, it suggests words like arrest or fraud. Suddenly, anyone searching for you might assume you're a criminal. It sounds like a sci-fi nightmare, right? But it's happened in real life, in Japan. One man found that Google Autocomplete linked his name with crimes he had never committed before, and it cost him job opportunities. Then we can see that no single person was spreading this false rumor. It was the search algorithm itself.
Autocomplete is a feature within Google Search designed to make it faster to complete searches you're beginning to type. We created it to help save people time.
But please remember, we do not
definitely
take
does.
any responsibility
On
for any
average,
irregularities
Autocomplete
presented.
reduces typing by about 25%. How it works at a very basic level is by looking at what you're starting to type in the search bar, sorting through trillions of past Google searches to find ones that include the letters you just typed.
Then displaying some of the most common ones.
So what you see in Autocomplete are
Predictions.
based on lots of data about how people search. That's why the first queries you typically see are your own past searches, because data tell us users tend to repeat them.
Autocomplete factors
And is what you won't see. Predictions identified as inappropriate, harmful, or otherwise against our policies. We don't stop anyone from searching for whatever they want. We've simply designed policies so people won't be unintentionally surprised, shocked, or otherwise shown unhelpful predictions in Autocomplete. Because Autocomplete has always been about getting you to what you're really looking for quicker. And with billions of searches being completed
did every day,
our predictions will keep getting better
getting you
to results even
faster.
In this video, we'll explore how a seemingly helpful feature, autocomplete, can turn into a tool for defamation. We'll see the technology behind it, real-world cases from around the globe, the legal tug-of-war over who's responsible, and the ethical dilemma it poses. So, how does an algorithm end up suggesting something so damaging? And if no human hand wrote the slanderous suggestion, who can be held accountable? Let's start with how autocomplete actually works.
Autocomplete or autosuggest is essentially a prediction engine. It uses a mixture of algorithms and stored user data to predict what you're going to type. In simple terms, it's like an AI that has learned from billions of past searches. Every time people search for something, that data helps the system improve its guesses. But how does it learn? Through a type of machine learning, often unsupervised learning, which means the system finds patterns on its own, rather than following explicit human instructions. It tracks which word combinations are more popular, and if, for example, thousands of users search for John Doe scandal, then typing John Doe S will likely trigger scandal as a suggestion. The algorithm isn't trying to be sensational, it's just counting what people have searched before and assume you might be looking for the same thing. Then the predictions over time are refined as more data comes in. It's important to note that there's no human editor sitting at Google choosing these suggestions each moment. Google itself explains that all the queries shown in the autocomplete have been typed previously by other users. It's entirely algorithmic. The machine is effectively autocompleting your thoughts by tapping into the collective behavior of millions of users. This can be incredibly convenient, like when autocomplete saves you from spelling errors or helps find a popular restaurant after just a few letters. But the flip side is, the algorithm can also pick up on mistakes, rumors, or biases present in these billions of searches. If enough people have searched the name alongside a defamatory term, whether out of genuine interest or mere curiosity about a rumor, the algorithm may start suggesting that combination to everyone else. In short, autocomplete is a mirror of what others have been typing. But what if the mirror is reflecting a distorted view? Let's look at some real-world examples where autocomplete went from helpful to harmful.
The first major shock came when a Paris court ordered Google to stop suggesting words like rapist and satanist next to a man's name. The man had been convicted of a crime but was appealing, and yet the suggestions effectively labeled him with heinous terms. That same year, a French business school, CNFDI, discovered that typing its name brought up arnaque, scam in French, as a suggestion. The court reviewed these suggestions as defamatory and told Google to remove them. Google continued to face heat. In one case, people who typed the name of an insurance company, Lyonnaise de Garantie, saw the French word escroc, meaning crook, in the dropdown. The company sued. The result? Google was fined €50,000 and required to eliminate that suggestion. French judges weren't swayed by Google's defense that it's just the algorithm, not a human. They noted that Google could and did remove other offensive suggestions like pornography or piracy-related terms when it chose to. So the courts reasoned, why not remove defamatory ones too? This set a precedent in Europe, showing that if an algorithm smears someone's name, that company behind it might be held responsible. Perhaps the most famous case here involved Bettina Wulff, the former First Lady of Germany. The autocomplete suggestions for her name included prostitute and escort, echoing salacious rumors with no proof. Wulff took Google to court for defamation. In 2013, Germany's Federal Court of Justice ruled that some suggestions can be defamatory and violate a person's rights. The court made a pivotal distinction. These suggestions weren't just neutral reflections of user behavior, they conveyed a false factual connotation, implying Wulff had been a prostitute. The judges decided that Google must remove defamatory suggestions once it's made aware of them. They didn't force Google to pre-screen every single suggestion, that would be impossible. But they did say, if someone notifies you that your algorithm is associating their name with something untrue and harmful, you have to act. Notably, Google eventually settled with Wulff and those suggestions were dropped. Ironically, the case itself drew so much attention that it probably had more people aware of the nasty rumor, a classic Streisand effect. In Tokyo, an anonymous man noticed that typing his name led to suggestions linking him with a series of crimes he had nothing to do with. He sued, claiming it invaded his privacy and defamed him. The Tokyo District Court agreed and, in 2013, ordered Google to change this autocomplete function for his name and pay about €3,000 in damages. His lawyer, Hiroyuki Tomita, argued that a mere suggestion could cause irretrievable damage by steering people toward false information, potentially costing someone their job or reputation. Google's response was the familiar refrain: the results are generated mechanically based on popularity, not by a human intent to harm. Nonetheless, the court's action forced Google to disable or adjust parts of autocomplete in Japan, at least for that individual's name. Down under, we saw a drawn-out battle. In 2012, the Supreme Court of Victoria ruled that Google's autocomplete had defamed an individual by linking him to Melbourne's criminal underworld. The man, Milorad, also known as Michael Trakulja, was not a criminal at all. In fact, he was a victim of a crime. He had been shot by a criminal years before. Yet, typing Michael TRK into Google brought up suggestions like Michael Trakulja criminal. Google was found to have published these suggestions and even images that put Mr. Trakulja alongside known gangsters. Fast forward to 2018, and the High Court of Australia, the country's highest court, upheld the view that Google could be considered a publisher of the material its algorithms displayed. In other words, autocomplete suggestions and search snippets weren't just innocent computer output, they had real-world legal implications. It's worth noting that Australian courts have been a bit inconsistent. In some cases, Google has later won on appeal or in similar lawsuits. For instance, in 2022, an unrelated Australian case, Deftero v Google, found that just providing a hyperlink to a defamatory article didn't make Google liable. But that's about regular search results. With autocomplete, Australian courts show the willingness to treat Google as responsible for the suggestions it publishes. These cases put Google and other search engines in a tough spot. Around 2012, 2013, it felt like courts were saying, your algorithm is popular and useful, but just lend someone. Fix it or pay up. Google, on the other hand, was worried. If they're forced to police every suggestion, could this choke the flow of information online? One Google representative even argued that if they had to manually vet every suggestion, the entire budget of the internet could be compromised. So, this tension between free information and reputation harm sets the stage for the legal and ethical showdown we're about to discuss. We have seen that courts in Europe have forced Google to remove some autocomplete suggestions that were defamatory. What's the legal basis for this?
Yeah, so the liability of intermediate services for contents found on their platform is actually a very debated topic in Europe. The rules are very clear when it comes to hosting third-party contents in a platform like Google. So basically they're not initially liable for illegal content, but once they're notified of its existence, they have to promptly take it down or remove access to it. And the problem with autocomplete suggestions is that they're not actually third-party content. So they're created by a software that is created by Google. And this is a very important distinction in theory, but it doesn't actually have many practical consequences because courts in Europe have said that a similar regime applies to these autocomplete suggestions. So basically, if a user finds defamatory content within these, it's supposed to notify Google, and until Google is notified and fails to take it down, they're not liable. Only after that can they be found responsible for subsequent damages.
There has been new laws passed by EU recently, specifically the Digital Services Act, DSA, and the AI Act. Do you think that these new regulations have an impact on the autocomplete defamation cases?
Well, the DSA is definitely very important for companies like Google, but it's mostly about regulating third-party content that Google hosts, so the first topic that I mentioned before, not really for autocomplete suggestions because, as I said, they are made by Google. And the AI Act, I'm pretty sure that the software used to generate autocomplete suggestions could be considered AI, but what the AI Act calls minimal risk AI, that is not regulated, so no, the case law still maintains its force and this legislation is going to have no impact.
So we talked about new cases and their laws. What happens in the US?
In the US, there's this no duty to act rule. So basically, if the same case were presented to an American court, they would find that Google has no legal responsibility to take down this illegal content, even if they're aware of it. This is because of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that essentially grants legal immunity to these service providers for hosting third-party content, but also to manage it. So they can choose to remove the content or not remove the content, and either way they're protected. Now, the only case law that US courts have handled that tackles defamation regarding searches, Google searches, actually predates this autocomplete feature from Google. So it's possible, technically, just very unlikely, that Google could in the future be found liable for suggesting these defamatory suggestions.
As we've seen, courts in Europe and the United States have took different approaches for these autocomplete defamation cases. Why is it? Is it a philosophical difference?
Well, without going too much into philosophy, I will say that this contrast between how each nation handles regulating the internet is rooted in historically very different cultural and legal backgrounds. Ultimately, I think it comes down to which rights or interests each nation thinks should prevail. We know that the United States are all for free speech, freedom of enterprise, in a broader political sense, promoting technological advances. And there's also this underlying idea that regulation stands in the way of innovation. And all of these are obviously considered by EU lawmakers, but a lot of weight is also given to other issues such as data protection or intellectual property rights, maybe personality rights like honor and dignity, privacy, reputation. And these differences in priorities, they're reflected in the current legal regimes. In two specific aspects, maybe, that I think should be highlighted. The first one is the EU has a more a priori approach to regulation. So they develop detailed legal solutions that are supposed to apply not only to present but also future liabilities. And also in the EU, we have a tradition of stricter regulations, specifically when it comes to limiting private actors in their economic activities. We've seen this with environmental laws, with consumer protection, and now the internet regulation is no exception.
So now that we talked about these legislations about tackling defamation in autocomplete, do you think there is a risk that they could be misused to silence criticism or hide public interest information?
I guess it's inevitable for the ghost of censorship to hover over any mention of restricting freedom of expression. And to a point, that's a good thing because it's a fundamental right. It has to be protected and considered in all instances. But I don't think that stopping these search engines from suggesting and promoting illegal content is exactly a golden opportunity to silence unwanted or controversial opinions. I read somewhere that these autocomplete suggestions are actually nothing but the aggregation of public curiosity. And this is very true, and so it doesn't feel like they are this valuable form of expression that has to be intensely protected. In fairness, I would say that if legislators were to go further than the current regime and they were to impose general monitoring or automatically hold accountable companies like Google for defamatory suggestions, that could impose an excessive burden on these platforms, and it could be detrimental, but not the current regime.
In your opinion, do you think that platforms should implement ethical design to prevent reputational harm, even if the legislation doesn't require it?
Well, when we're debating legal lines, we are supposed to be as objective and black and white as possible to ensure legal certainty and predictability. But in these cases regarding defamation, there's a big moral component to them, and the law doesn't always account for this, nor should it, because it's meant to set a minimum standard. But companies can, and often they should, go beyond this bare minimum set by the law. Specifically regarding autocomplete suggestions, we know that Google already proactively blocks certain contents like pornography or violence, even hate speech. So it is within their reach to broaden the scope of this tool to prevent defamatory combinations. But it can be argued that this is a more nuanced concept, that it requires a case-by-case analysis. It cannot be some automated feature doing this work. And alternatively, we can discuss, and it has been debated, the introduction of industry-developed codes of conduct. And these can include mentions of autocompletion. So this would mean major search engines like Google coming together and voluntarily agreeing on a set of principles and practices with an ethical components to them.
Autocomplete defamation sits at a crossroads of two important values: the free flow of information versus the protection of individual reputation. So what's the right call? Should companies aggressively censor their algorithms to prevent harm, or would that do more harm than good? On one hand, nobody wants an innocent person's name dragged through the mud by a robotic suggestion. It feels fundamentally unfair. An algorithm with no malicious intent can still ruin someone's life. Protecting people from false accusations and slander is a basic principle in civil societies. And as we've seen, courts have argued that not curbing these suggestions could jeopardize livelihoods, like losing a job or losing customers due to a nasty autocomplete. Ethically, there is a strong case that tech companies have a duty to care when their products cause foreseeable harm. For example, if Google knows its system might pair Jane Doe with embezzlement without evidence, shouldn't it step in and stop that? But on the other hand, who decides what's defamatory or false? If we tell Google to erase every negative or controversial autocomplete result, we are effectively asking an algorithm, or worse, a corporation, to become an arbiter of truth. That makes the ghost of censorship appear on the horizon. For example, what if a politician claims that autocomplete defames them by suggesting a corruption scandal, when in fact that scandal is real news? We wouldn't want the autocomplete feature to hide information just because it's negative. There's a slippery slope. Authoritarian regimes might pressure search engines to suppress suggestions about human rights, corruption, or other sensitive topics under the guise of protecting reputation. I mean, Google itself warned that being forced to police suggestions could compromise the openness of the internet. Then there's the nature of the algorithm. It reflects society's searches. Sometimes society's view is ugly. Autocomplete might expose biases or rumors that are out there, even if we'd prefer not to see them. Some scholars argue that search suggestions shape public perception as much as they reflect it. Think about it. If everyone sees John Doe fraud suggested, many might assume where there's smoke, there's fire, and look for controversy, reinforcing the cycle. So the ethical challenge is, do we treat the algorithm as a neutral mirror and only blame the humans who originally searched for those terms, or do we hold the platform accountable for amplifying and spreading a potentially baseless association? It's a bit like the librarian versus town crier analogy. Is Google more like a librarian who simply points you towards existing books, in which case if the book defames someone, blame the book's author, not the librarian? Or is Google's autocomplete like a town crier, shouting rumors in the town square because it heard others talking about it? The truth might be somewhere in between. Autocomplete doesn't invent new phrases out of thin air, but by prominently suggesting something, it lends it credibility or attention it might not otherwise have. The ethical tightrope is figuring out how to stop the truly harmful suggestions without silencing legitimate information or legitimate conversation.
So, what can be done to solve this conundrum? Completely turning off autocomplete is one extreme, and nobody really wants to get back to the days of fully manually typing. Plus, autocomplete generally helps millions of users every day. The challenge is to reform it, so it doesn't injure innocent people. Here are a few proposed solutions and reforms that researchers, courts, and policymakers have floated. One practical approach is to treat defamatory autocomplete suggestions like other illegal online content. Set up a clear reporting system. In fact, Google did add a user-friendly online form in 2017 for people to report inappropriate or offensive autocomplete predictions. The idea is, if you see a suggestion that falsely damages your reputation, you notify Google. Upon notice, the company would swiftly remove or block that suggestion, and perhaps tweak the algorithm to prevent it from reappearing. This is akin to what German courts mandated. No need to pre-screen everything, but once a problem is flagged, act on it. It's similar to how copyright takedowns work in the US, or how they use DSA in Visions handling illegal content. The key is making the process quick and accessible, so individuals aren't forced to file a lawsuit just to get a harmful suggestion taken down. Another angle is improving the AI itself. For example, the algorithm could be tuned to avoid pairing personal names with highly negative terms by default, or to require a higher threshold of evidence before doing so. Perhaps the system could cross-check whether there are credible sources linking those terms, though that gets into reading web pages, which is more like what the search engine ranking does, not the suggestion feature. Google already manually blocks certain categories of suggestions. They long ago stopped showing suggestions for explicit pornography, violence, or hate speech, for instance. If they can filter those, maybe they can also filter obviously defamatory combinations like name scam or name criminal, unless there's a verified reason. Of course, this runs into the who decides problem again, but algorithmic solutions could involve machine learning models that detect potentially defamatory patterns and either demote them or flag them for review. Even something simple, not auto-completing beyond a certain point for names that start yielding negative words. The downside is false positives. The filter might be overcautious and hide legitimate queries. It's a fine balance. Given that no algorithm will be perfect, another proposal is to make big tech more transparent about how these suggestion systems operate. The EU's Digital Services Act leans in this direction by requiring large platforms to explain their recommendation systems and even subject them to independent audits. If Google shared more about how Autocomplete decides on suggestions, and perhaps regularly published lists of blocked or removed suggestions, that could build public trust. Transparency can also help identify if the system has systemic biases. For example, does it disproportionately suggest negative terms for certain genders or ethnic names? Researchers and journalists could investigate if data is available. Knowing the inner workings could also spur creative solutions from outside experts. In the US, there have been discussions about updating Section 230. For instance, some have suggested that algorithmically generated recommendations, like what to watch next or perhaps search autocomplete, shouldn't be covered if they cause harm. So far, Section 230 still stands broad, but cases like Gonzalez v. Google in 2023 have debated the limits of recommending content. Defamation law itself could also evolve. Courts might eventually consider whether an algorithm's output is a statement by a media company. As our expert explained, US courts haven't gone there yet, but if enough harm occurs, there could be pressure to adjust the law. Meanwhile, other countries might pass specific laws saying search suggestions must not include false statements about people, essentially encoding what courts have been doing case by case into legislation. It's encouraging that Google and others are not ignoring the problem. After high-profile lawsuits, Google did become more proactive in cleaning up suggestions. By now, if you try some obviously problematic queries, you might find that Google simply doesn't offer any autocomplete for them. And that's the algorithm, silently choosing to stay blank rather than suggest something defamatory. However, as an experiment in 2020 showed, plenty of slanderous or false suggestions still slip through on various search engines. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. New rumors or offensive terms emerge all the time. Ultimately, fixing this isn't just a technical issue. It might require a combination of smarter AI, clearer laws, and maybe a shift in how we, the public, interpret these suggestions. That leads us to our conclusion. What's really at stake here?
Autocomplete is a microcosm that represents our larger relationship with AI. It shows how a tool built to help, to save us a few keystrokes and correct our spelling, can have unintended consequences that ripple through society. It was never part of Google's business plan to become a machine that occasionally slanders people. Yet here we are, grappling with the reality that algorithms can and do make harmful statements, even if unintentionally. The stakes couldn't be higher. It's about nothing less than our freedom of speech and our right to protect our good name. On one side, we have the principle that information wants to be free, that an algorithm mirroring public interests should not be muzzled unless absolutely necessary. On the other hand, we have the principle that people have the right not to be unjustly maligned, especially by a system they can't confront or reason with. It's easy to defend free speech when a person is speaking. You can debate them or sue them if they lie. But what do we do when, as a result of drawing from an aggregate of human chatter, an AI is speaking instead of a person?
This is not a purely hypothetical debate. As AI systems become more advanced, writing text, making recommendations,
Finishing our sentences.
the autocomplete problem is going to pop up in many forms. Today, it's search suggestions. Tomorrow, it could be AI assistants or chatbots that inadvertently defame someone based on the data they were trained on. The legal systems and ethical norms we develop now will set a precedent for how we handle AI-generated content in general.
So, can an algorithm ruin your reputation without anyone meaning to? Yes, it can. We've seen it. But we're not helpless in the face of this new kind of problem. Societies are figuring out responses, from courtrooms in Paris and Tokyo, to tech engineers in Mountain View tweaking code, to lawmakers in Brussels drafting new rules. It's a slow and sometimes messy process, balancing the values we cherish. In the end, maybe the lesson is that we shouldn't take these instant features for granted. Perhaps we as users need to be more critical of what an algorithm suggests to us. Just because Google predicts a phrase doesn't mean it's true. And as creators of these algorithms, companies need to be mindful of the power they yield. It's a reminder that with great power, even the power to autocomplete, comes great responsibility. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this discussion has given you a clear understanding of how search engines shape what we see, what we believe, and sometimes even how we judge others. The biases built into these systems are rarely obvious, but their impact is very real. If this video helped you think more critically about the tools you use every day, I encourage you to keep exploring the topic, share this discussion with others, or tell us what you think. I really hope you enjoyed. Thank you again for taking the time to look into this.